You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everyone, welcome to Where No BUBS Has Gone Before, a Star Trek The Next Generation podcast hosted by myself, Jay Reckward, and my father, Jake Reckward. We are recording this for the benefit of my son, Ben, but we know there are so many great Star Trek fans out there. We're releasing all of these episodes for free out on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm fine, Jay, and you?
Good. Tonight's a very special episode, and in some ways we've been talking about Season 3 as being the season where the quality of Star Trek The Next Generation really picks up. And I think for the last two episodes, we reviewed yesterday's Enterprise and talked a lot about time and the nature of time travel, but also the nature of multi-universes and alternate universes and Guinan and all that. A really great episode. I think today is a really special episode in itself because in some ways it touches on what this podcast started as, father and son talking with each other about a show that brought them together for your grandson and my son to one day hopefully listen back upon fondly and with some introspection. But the episode that we're reviewing tonight, The Offspring, which is Star Trek The Next Generation Season 3, Episode 16, which debuted on March 12th, 1990. I think that this is a very special episode in many, many ways because it deals with some world building from a previous season. It also expands on the nature of what is life. But at the core of it, it gets into the discussion of parenting. And I think tonight we're going to have a very rich conversation about that. So let's get right into it. Do you have any general thoughts about the quality of this episode before we get into the actual story itself? Any reflections of where you were in 1990 as a parent? Just your general thoughts.
Nothing really related to how things were in 1990, other than I think it was interesting that here we are in 2021, and there's so much discussion about transgender and all of these sexual role things,
Right?
What pronouns you use, and so forth. And in some ways, when Data allowed his offspring, his daughter Lao, or his offspring Lao, to choose her gender and appearance, it was kind of like an early discussion of the current gender issues.
I think that we're going to have some very interesting discussions about that tonight because Star Trek, I think, takes a very revolutionary stance in 1990 that is maybe subconscious to us then, but is very out in the open now, and something that I think that we look back on and go, hey, maybe this idea was already in our heads.
Right.
But, I think one thing about this episode that is really appealing to me as both a writer and a viewer. Technically, this is called a bottle episode, and what a bottle episode is, and I think we discussed this previously
No,
on another episode.
Yeah, I don't remember this term though. Go ahead to explain it.
Well, just in case we need to review, a bottle episode is essentially when you have a storyline that is contained to just the general characters themselves. You may bring one or two more characters on, but like in general, everything happens in the setting itself. It's very contained. There's usually not that much of an outside interference coming in. Usually that these episodes to themselves are cheaper to make because they require less aesthetic requirements and more materialistic output. Um, One thing before we continue with this episode, I want to make note that The Offspring is the first episode directed by a member of the cast. This episode is directed by Jonathan Frakes.
Oh.
This is actually the first episode that Jonathan Frakes will be directing. He, of course, plays Commander William Riker. And you'll note during the episode, The Offspring, he's actually not there a lot. Riker is not actually partaking with the characters, and the few times that he does appear, it's there for good effect. But for the most part, Jonathan Frakes was off camera the entire time, and
Yes.
a lot of this came because he wanted to direct episodes, and he just pestered Rick Berman. And one thing that Rick Berman made Jonathan Frakes do is actually go and learn how to edit and observe. And he actually made Frakes somewhat go through film school in a kind of an apprenticeship
Hmm.
through the first couple seasons of Star Trek. And this script, which everyone loved, kind of came along and was the opportunity for Jonathan Frakes to have his directorial debut. And in a lot of people's opinion, and one that I hold, I think Jonathan Frakes is the best director out of Star Trek. He's not only directed a lot of great Next Generation episodes, he's directed episodes for Voyager and Deep Space Nine. He's also directed episodes for Picard and Discovery. I really like his directing style. The movies as well. He directed First Contact and Insurrection. For me, I was watching First Contact this weekend with Margot and Ben. I think that movie holds up as one of the best Star Trek movies of all time.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, but I think this is a really special episode on many different levels. Um, but digging in, so the Enterprise is en route to Sector 396 to begin charting the Celebri asteroid belt. So before we even get started, like charting the Celebi asteroid belt has no bearing whatsoever on the episode at all. It's kind of a throwaway line.
Right. Yes.
So Wesley Crusher, Geordi LaForge, and Counselor Deanna Troy are walking down the corridor of the Enterprise D towards Data's lab, where he has summoned them without revealing to them why. As they are walking, they speculate to what Data may have in store for him, with LaForge revealing that since returning from a cybernetics conference, Data has been spending every free second in the lab while keeping it locked. When they finally arrive to the lab, they find out that he has created a Sung-type android and named it Lal. The android greets him and somewhat taken aback, they realize it calls Data father, upon which Data states that Lal, in fact, is his child. So that is basically the entire premise of the episode. Data has created life. Um, you and I have talked a lot about Data in the past, and the brilliance of Brett Spiner, and there's going to be a lot of wonderful Brett Spiner moments this episode. One person I think that really needs to be mentioned for her role and performance as as Data's android daughter Lal is Haley Todd. Um, Really great episode, a huge range of emotion and performance. Um, but Data has now created life because he went to a cybernetics conference, which I find interesting. Um, you have a unique android in the universe who attends a cybernetics conference
Right.
as like a guest.
Yes.
Um,
It's like having one of those robotic vacuum cleaners right now going to a vacuum cleaner convention.
I actually find that to be a very interesting quirk about the future, especially if here in the modern real world we continue to develop AI.
Right.
You know, in many ways we've discussed that data is the embodiment of AI itself, or the potential future of it. Um, One thing I wonder is if we advance to a society one day where we have maybe some sort of artificial intelligence that is embodied in the form of an android or some sort of cybernetic being, if we are on some level able to work with them on the way that the organic crew or the biological crew, humans, Klingons, betazoids, what have you, work with data, how do you think it would be working side by side with this kind of embodied AI, or going to you went to a lot of conferences in tissue banking and eye donation. How would you feel going to a conference with an android, that kind of knows everything that you know, but knows it more, and in some way the embodiment of everything that you research?
Boy, that's a good question. I don't have off the top of my head a good uh, answer for it. I mean, I'm just thinking that it's kind of presented as something that could occur in the future. I can't think of a specific science fiction movie other than separate from Star Trek where you have a human character that has um, an android or a robotic sidekick. I mean, the one that pops into mind is that strange kind of box-like device, friend that was in Interstellar.
Right. Oh, have you seen? I'm trying to remember. It's an Oscar Isaac film, Ex Machina. Have you seen the film Ex Machina?
No, I have not.
So, Ex Machina is a very interesting film where it follows this researcher who is visiting essentially an Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos type character, a super wealthy billionaire who has developed a AI that can basically beat the Turing test. So it's essentially, it can fool a computer into thinking that it's a human. Um, Along the way, that movie shows the AI actually being embodied into the form of beautiful women. So like there during the story there comes to be this sexualized part of it. But the idea of like working side by side or even living side by side with like an embodied AI that looks and feels human. We've talked previously about like sex bots in previous episodes, especially the one I think the Naked Now where Data and Tasha Yar have intimate relations. But I think the idea of actually going to like a professional conference or going to any sort of public setting and seeing or interacting with AI on that level has to assume a bunch of things happen first. And it's some things that we've talked about previously. Um, I think we would have to have a certain leveling with AI that I think biologically the conceit of Star Trek is like Data, despite having like overwhelming speed and being able to like do trillions of permutations per minute. I'm sorry, trillions of permutations per minute. He is still relatively like leveled with the rest of the humans in the show. Because in the real world, he would be like, people at home can't see my hands, but like we're down here, he's wildly up here in terms of his ability. I think that if we were to have a society where these kind of embodied AI beings existed beside of us, there would have to be some sort of leveling system, even on our end, biologically or cybernetically, to keep up with them. Or we would have had to have, I don't want to say dumb down the AI, but we would have had to tone them or tune them down to a level that we could manage them on that level. If anything, it would maybe look like iRobot and the Will Smith version of iRobot. Do you remember that film?
Sure. Yeah.
I think in many ways it might look like that, but that version of iRobot really casts androids as kind of this servitile slash slave race that we're constantly disposing of too, and I think that there's a worry of that being addressed in this episode.
Well, one comment it just thought was if you just follow the development of Star Trek, particularly getting into, I guess, the first season of Picard, and you have the augments. I mean,
Yes,
that
absolutely.
concept, the augments are, and of course, Data still is around in that first season of Picard, and um, you know, Picard as a human interacts with augments on a pretty much, I guess, somewhat of an equal level. But of course,
Hmm.
Picard's physical body is damaged and he dies and he becomes an augment himself.
Well, it's interesting because in Picard they come up with this term. You know, in Picard they come up with this term, and they even use it outright. They say they put him in what's essentially a golem. Like his body will age, and he will
That's
continue to
right.
live like
That's right.
a
Yeah,
regular.
I remember
I
that.
guess he will live out his regular human life, but they use this term golem,
Yes.
um, which is this kind of Jewish term of creating this kind of. It, I mean, it's kabbalistic from the Kabbalah of being able to actually create a person or creature out of clay and then infuse it with some sort of divine essence and actually animate that body or creature. It's almost like Hebrew Frankenstein in a way, but not. It's much more sacred and complicated than that. Even though it's popularly used in horror, golems are actually God bless you. Um,
Thank you.
but golems traditionally are like seen as guardians of
Yeah, I'm
things.
just reading from the Tolkien Forum. Golem is a creature of Jewish medieval folklore. A golem is a figure made into the form of a human and given life.
Yes,
The creature is then
yes,
slave to its master's commands.
yes. And there's multiple stories of like golems in medieval Jewish storytelling that are really fascinating in themselves. So like it's interesting how Picard's golem origins were inspired. But I think one thing that you mentioned was Picard has to one central thing that Picard deals with in his spin-off series is Data's daughters in the form of um, I think Daj and Soji.
That's right. Yeah, I couldn't remember their names.
And we're never really given like I have to go back and watch the series again, and I'm planning to soon because I recently got Paramount Plus, folks. Which, by the way, I think's worth it for $5.99. I think that's worth the subscription price if you can pay for it. Um, if you can't, like, steal it, folks. Um, but we're never given a real explanation of how Data is. We know that like Daj and Soji are Data's daughters because they carry like some part of his positronic matrix with them. With with them, but we're never like actually clued into how everyone is made, and including Eric Sung on the planet of the augments, um, or the androids.
Well, here's two questions that are somewhat related to get to this. That
Yeah.
in my notes is when after Picard has gone to Data's lab and is astounded,
Yes.
dumbfounded, and concerned that as to what Data has done, and he's walking through the corridor with Troy. Troy says, "Why should biology rather than technology determine whether it is a child?" And related to that,
Well.
that related to that
Yes.
also is the discussion of whether law is sentient. And there's a question at some point, even Data talks about this, is at what point does law become sentient? And
So
just my opinion to answer the second question first is, um, I think as soon as Data activates law, and law is recognizes that she has a self identity and she knows that Data is her father. As soon as she switched on, she has sentience.
absolutely,
Now,
I agree.
getting back to the first part, which is really it kind of segues from the discussion about the augments, maybe in the Picard series, about um, if you have an offspring, if you have a child, does it have to be totally biologic, or in a new framework, a new construction? Could you have this technological forum or being where you can have a child,
So
which is what this whole episode brings up.
so the show in the past and in multiple series have dealt with this question in pretty unique ways. I think the overall answer that Star Trek would probably posit if we were to force the writers to answer this question, I think that they would answer like, technology shouldn't determine whether or not something is defined as a child. I think how we value children is something that has to be made by either the individual who is taking part in the shaping of this offspring or the society that's taking part in its rearing. Um, I think I want to go back to the thing about sentience for a bit because sentience was one of the primary questions that matter of a man, is that what it's
Yes,
called?
yeah, because
Measure of a man.
that's a very
Measure of a man.
that's a very important episode in relation to this episode. Correct.
Well, it's interesting because Melinda Snodgrass, who was a lawyer that wrote Measure of a Man in season two, was somewhat hesitant to do a rewrite of this episode because she thought that Measure of a Man answered the question about sentience.
Right.
But I think the interesting thing about sentience is how it's held up in this episode. Because in Measure of the Man, the question is Data sentient? And Picard argues the question, well, how do you know you're sentient? How do you know I'm sentient? And, like, I think, and I don't have our notes, so if I butcher this, Dad, or if I butcher this for anyone at home, apologies. I think one thing that, like, um, Picard sets as a standard for sentience is like awareness and like awareness of your own well being, but also like an awareness of your fate. And I think being able to play, I think one thing that Picard is able to do is prove that Data values himself. And in that sentience, and in that, I'm sorry, I'm trying to line my words up correctly. Sorry, Dad. Um, try this again. Um, Picard shows that in Data's ability to value himself and his own outcome in a measure of the man, because we have to remember the outcome of the measure of the man is that Data is going to be taken from the Enterprise and taken to the Daystrom Institute. It's funny that the Daystrom Institute shows up again in this episode.
Mm-hmm.
Though though I think that where they're going to take Lal is like a different
A star,
lab
a
on a
star,
different planet,
yeah, a Starfleet R&D lab. Yes.
right? On Galore Four, if
Right.
I'm correct.
Yes. Correct.
Um, but the Daystrom Institute, like originally in A Measure of Man, we're going to take Data and like deconstruct him for the purposes of studying his circuitry, with hoping that they would be able to produce more of him. So they were able to produce. Picard was able to prove that since Data was unique in valuing himself and being able to place value in other things, his sentience that is enough to assure his sentience, and that was enough to approve of his rights in a legal sense and set the precedent that I think makes certain aspects of this episode difficult, but we'll get into that.
Well,
But
in
if I
some,
may finish, if I
yeah,
may finish
yeah,
real quick,
yeah, go ahead.
what sentience is being held up to in this episode now is like, what's the moment you become mature enough to make your own decisions? Not just be sentient. When are you worthy of your own decision making? Because the question is Lal able to make her decision? Is Lal being brought up in an environment where she will be able to make the right calls and be like Data, who is trusted enough to be allowed on a starship and serve in Starfleet and be independent?
Well, this episode has some degree of redundancy with Measure of the
Yes.
Man. However, it's looking at the questions of sentience and what rights does an android, a sentient android, have from a different perspective. And
Well, it's also a question of what rights children in our real world have in terms of
yes,
determining their own fate.
well, and that gets into what I was thinking as you were talking is, I have this idea that you made the point that is part of the definition of sentience that an individual or a being can make decisions for itself. So,
Hmm.
you know, what I think happens, and of course, this is my experience, and in talking to people, no one remembers what it was like to be a baby, to be an infant. And
Right.
they really cannot make decisions for themselves. They make decisions to cry if
Yes.
they're hungry or they're uncomfortable, but that's almost an instinctual type thing. It's a mechanistic type thing. The first memory I have was, I think,
Right.
when I was like close to 2 or something like that, and my parents took me on an uncle's wedding in New York, and I can remember seeing a train because we went from Baltimore to New York on the train. But I can, that when I think about memories, I can think of an event when I was 4, and that's the only clear memory I have. I can't think of things that happened when I was 3, but I can remember events when I was 4, specific events, and from then on, I can kind of reconstruct things. But then it gets into, but then that still doesn't answer the question. When I was aware of, and when I could remember things when I was 4 years old, did I have the ability, or was I making decisions for myself then?
Ah, very good question. Oh, very very good observation. Ooh. Wow, there's a lot baked into that. And I think you nail a lot of the questions that are we're bringing up in the episode on the head here. Um, my earliest memory, I think I remember some things about our house in Maryland and Bel Air. I think there were some bay windows.
Yeah, yeah. And
And then I remember a neighbor's basement where they had a punching bag.
okay.
Um, but I think that was Bel Air. And then I remember parts of Aunt Frances's house. Um, honestly, the the first decision I remember being able to make, and it was for me that I was able to make. Mom will tell you there was a story of how I like lifted this Mickey Mouse out of the Disney store, and how she was like, "Well, it was the first thing you ever picked for yourself, so like we kept it."
Right.
Um,
Oh, that was, you picked it up and then you went and threw it in the fountain at the mall.
yeah, but then I had the audacity to make the decision to throw it into a fountain. Like you said, Dad. Babies and toddlers make decisions, but they're not necessarily thinking them through. Um, I actually think that the first time I made a real decision, um, we were all together. It was summer. We were at Francis's, and I can't believe. And I remember this clearly, and I'm not just saying this for the show, folks. Dad, do you remember the VHS collection we had of the first 6 Star Trek films?
Mm-hmm.
We had them one summer, and someone let me make the decision of like which one we were going to watch.
Mm,
And I think I picked Star Trek 6
mm,
because it was the new one.
hmm.
But like I think that's the decision I remember making. Um I think as I watch Ben mature now into, he's not 2 yet, but watching him make decisions is such a different thing because on one hand he makes decisions to do things all the time, like shift his focus. I want to play with this, I want to run this way, I want to he definitely like signals and speak, is getting to the point where he's signaling what he wants from us now, and it's, that's a precursor to speech. um but he actually like pulls us by the hand places. He is starting to use words, but he is starting to like develop taste for food, and if he doesn't see certain things that he wants in the fridge, he'll have like a little temper tantrum recently. So like that in itself is a decision making
Hmm.
process
Hmm.
because, he's deciding, I like this thing, I want to see this thing, I want to eat this thing, and then I can't find this thing, and I'm going to make the decision to freak the fuck out. But that is decision making.
It is. He just doesn't know how to
And it's
express. Yeah.
Well, like, it's actually a decision making that we see in some level at the end of this episode when Lal is told, like, there's a potential that this admiral's going to come and take you to Galore 4. And she has this moment where she has a huge, anxiety slash panic attack. Um, I think that, um, I think the question about decision making gets into a much larger conversation about emotions, which this episode really concerns itself with. So,
Let's come back to that, but let's try to finish it up on the question of can an android
yes,
can a android have a child? Does a child have to be a product of a biological process?
I would say that if you're going to value a holographic being like the emergency medical holographic program on Voyager or the Doctor, um, as a living sentient being, if you're going to value Data as a living and sentient being, both of whom have rights, I think that if a sentient but non-biological being somehow creates something that it deems as a child, and that child in return deems its creator, like Law does for Data, as its father, um, for me, and I can only speak for me, yes, from a moral and ethical, but also philosophical perspective, I can make an argument that their parental bond is just as legitimate as any biological parental bond. And if anything, in some cases, more so.
Well, thinking through this, that if one non-biologic self-aware entity can create a similar non-biologic entity, and as is shown in this episode, the the new entity, the child, is going to have to be nurtured, even that if it involves just downloading programs into the
Mm.
entity and doing some training and nurturing of how the programs need to be used. It goes back to the one of the really interesting points that a conversation that Data and Lau have is she says, "Father, what is my purpose?" And he ends up
Mm-hmm.
saying, "It is the struggle itself that is most important." Oh, he says, "We are to contribute in a positive way to the world in which we live." And then he goes on in part of that conversation that it is the struggle itself to do so that is most important. It does not matter that we will never reach our ultimate goal. The effort yields its own rewards. It is the difference between knowledge and experience.
Well, Law says right after between those two things, "Father, you are wise," and Data says, "Well, wisdom is basically the wisdom is is the difference between knowledge and experience."
Right, right.
Um, I think, and let me look
But
at
that's an important point because Law
yeah.
has the knowledge, but she doesn't have the experience, and that's what Data, as a parent, works to provide her.
So you touched on so many different things that I kind of want to break down because they're all components of this larger episode.
Right.
Like I think you're summarizing a lot of big things at once,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's fine. But like, let's break them down a little bit. Um,
Sure.
and we can actually break them down into like component pieces of the actual story itself. Um, one thing that Data does from the beginning is that he's loading his heuristics, and I want to get I want to make sure I get the definition of heuristic correct. Um, Data downloads his uploads his heuristics onto Law's positronic matrix, or basically her neural net, and gives her the skills to basically discover or learn things from themselves, which is a key aspect of what Dr. Sung gave Data in his design as an android. Like, Data's real skill is that he is able to actually take the information he sees around them and adapt them in new ways that, like, most androids or maybe most AIs couldn't. I don't know. That might be a relic of the early 90s and us not understanding artificial intelligence as we understand it now.
That's a good point. Yes.
But one thing that like Data does is that he's imprinting his experiences and his abilities to adapt to the world onto his daughter, much the way that, you imprinted some of your patterns of behavior onto me, and I in turn am imparting my patterns of behavior onto Ben. Part of those patterns of behavior is the way that like we look at and we engage and we investigate the world, the kind of limits we set on it, the freedoms we give it. Um, Data is by imprinting his heuristics onto Law, basically teaching her development on the fly. And one thing that Margot and I learned very early on in child development is that when it comes to things like walking and talking, babies and toddlers actually know how to walk and talk already. They just haven't developed it. Like they know something that they don't know, and they just have to mature to it. In many ways, Law is doing something backwards. She already has the physical body of a mature woman. Like, how old do you think Law is? It's never really established in the episode, but she could be, what, 20, 21,
I would
maybe
say right.
22?
I would say right. Yeah, 20, right around 20. Yeah.
Honestly, and like the folks listening at home, this is no, I'm not trying to be ageist or anything, but the actress who plays her looks like she could be in college. Like,
Here's a question. Here's an observation that's
but
thrown in.
but if I may finish this real
Go ahead
quick.
and finish. Yeah.
Um, you know, Data creates his child a body of a woman that looks like she has already reached physical maturity, but she doesn't have the skills yet of even a toddler in terms of social interaction, developmental interaction. I mean, even though, the episode is told over a series of like days or weeks, because they have a little bit of a montage where she's learning how to like drink and learning how to use silverware, and she's able to pick that up really quick. Um, Data's done something interesting here where like physically she's way ahead of actually where she's starting.
As you said, she's sort of the reverse of a human child.
Yes, exactly.
Now, the other comment I wanted to make, since Data gave Lal many, many choices as to what her image could be,
Yeah, let's talk about this.
including an Andorian, a Klingon. And so if Lal had chosen to be a Klingon, how would he, let's say, a Klingon male, then he would have been Data's son. How would he been different? I don't know if we'll know the answer to that, because that's just an interesting little throw off.
So let I actually kind of want to look at how this scene is set up, because what happens is Data and Lal are spend some time observing people around the ship, and Lal is given the choice of, and we'll use the pronoun they in the singular for right now to talk about Lal before they choose their gender.
Sure.
But Lal, they observe other people on the ship, and they bring I think it's Counselor Troy. Is it just Counselor Troy who's there, or
I think
is
it was.
Geordi there too?
I don't remember. I don't. I think it was just Troy.
Okay,
Uh,
here, let me.
yeah, you can check.
I just. Yes, okay, it's Data and it's just Data, Lal, and Troy. So, um, Lal Lal decides for themselves that the four choices they give them are an Andorian female, a human male, a human female, and a Klingon male. And I think, if I remember, Troy and Data says, socialization may be hard if you choose the Andorian female because you'll be the only one on the ship. Um, Troy also says that the human male is very handsome, and that the human female is quite pretty, and that the Klingon male could be a friend for dwarf. I mean, a friend for Worf, not
Right.
dwarf. Sorry,
Right.
folks. Um, a friend for Worf. And one thing that I find interesting is that um, Lal looks at Troy and asks, "Which one do you like?" And I think Lal kind of somewhat makes her decision based on Troy, because we're not really ever given a distinct reason why Lal chooses to be a human female, but there's very much, she's taking her cues from Troy very much in this episode, and they do set it up that while Data is the paternalistic father figure, Troy very is much the maternalistic figure in Lal's life, kind of from the beginning. Even when she has that panic attack after the scene with the Admiral and Picard, the first person she goes to express her emotions is not necessarily her father. She goes right to Troy. I think one of the reasons why Lal chooses the gender she decides to express herself as is because, and this is a weird thing that I've actually read into a little bit, um, and it's not only like in terms of how people in the trans community choose their own gender identities, but how we choose our own gender identities as children.
Mhm.
We don't necessarily look to our fathers and mothers exclusively for these examples. We can look for these examples in popular fiction or mythology. We can look for them in people around us. There are people who are just as much influenced by their aunts and uncles or brothers and sisters, or just people, neighbors on the street, in terms of their ideas of how gender functions and operates, both on an individualistic level and on a societal or communal level, writ large. I think the point that I'm trying to get to here is that, on one hand, like in this scene, like, Law has made concrete choices for herself. She's given herself four concrete choices. But she refers to Data and Troy, and kind of refers to Troy exclusively because Data assents to Troy, in a sense, in this scene, and then Law assents to Troy. So there's very much kind of like this transference of not identity, but aspect onto each other.
Mhm.
And I think that that's an important thing that the show does very well, in terms of maybe highlighting how humans gender themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've done a lot of reading into the question of gender versus sex, and structural versus essential, and a lot of modernism versus postmodernism when it comes to the question of sexuality and gender identity. And I am of the belief that, to a certain extent, there may be some things about us that are masculine or feminine that are innate to us in nature, but how we actually express ourselves very much is societally constructed. For example, like, I grew up at a time in my generation where we saw the movie 300, and we all saw these buff Spartans fighting in their loincloths with spears and helmets on. But historically, like, from a southerner's perspective, the Spartans would have been these strange kind of like freaks. The soldiers, are having homosexual relations with each other because that culture valued that. They thought like men that slept with each other would actually value each other deeper in battle and fight harder.
Mm-hmm.
Segregation from women, that women, between the pure Spartan warrior caste, men and women really only got together to procreate. There's a lot of things that we think of when it comes to men and women, and going back to ancient times in terms of how these roles were constructed. But the truth is, throughout history, these roles have shifted and changed so dramatically in times and places. Like, here's an easy one. For example, a lot of dudes get made fun of today for being into craft beer and being into home brewing, and it's kind of this thing that, like, hairy dudes in the garage are doing. But historically, um, craft brewing was started by women, and it was considered a woman's trade.
Mm.
Going back to ancient times where women were the brewers, and it was almost kind of a magical skill in itself. So gender roles shift and change with history and culture and time, and just the different vagaries of human experiences based on region and the communities, and of course the individuals that are in it. So how this scene plays out is very interesting because I think on an anthropological and sociological level, it's not wrong, but it's at the same time it deals with it on a very humane sense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, One thing that I find interesting though when it comes to like what they do afterwards with Law is, even though she's been given the choice to, and I really want to know what you think of this, even though she's been given the choice to like choose her own gender identity, and even though she has like the same ability to think and learn and perform as well as Data, because Data was a Sung type android, could do trillions of permutations per second and pick up all these skills. And they found him, a Starfleet crew found him on Omicron Theta, and over time he had to learn to adapt. But I'm wondering if Data was treated as much as a child as Law is when he was being brought up.
That's an excellent question because that was actually one I didn't put in my notes, but I thought about that is as law was created by Data and is being
Mm-hmm.
nurtured, what did Dr. Soong do with Data to
Mm-hmm.
what was the process that Dr. Soong used with Data in a similar manner? We don't have an answer there.
Well, we have some clues in the story. Like, we know that there is some complication with lore in terms of who was created first. Lore, what so far, and I think there's a future episode where we see Dr. Song again.
Yeah.
But lore wasn't created first, but Data was created with the idea that he was going to be given this emotion chip. And then lore was created and somehow stole Data's emotion chip. But at some point, Data was active and then was deactivated and lost all of his memory, but he has the memories of all the colonists of Omicron Theta.
Oh, yes. Right.
So we, on one hand, it's like Data already has these. He already came with these skill sets preloaded. because he already had the experiences of the Omicron Theta colonists in him. So he didn't start with like, square one. It seems like Lal does. And if you can program heuristics and the ability to learn, I'm surprised Data didn't upload certain things like, okay, here's how you read, here's how you eat, here's how you do all these things.
Well,
I mean,
that brings up another point in question: is there's a difference between law and data in that
yeah,
law somehow has an understanding of human emotions, because and
yes,
the two examples are when she has the interview with Admiral Hafnell, and he says that
Haftel.
Haftel, and he does not give her a choice. She's going to be taken off the Enterprise, away from her father, by him, and she goes to
Hmm.
Troy and is demonstrably scared. And Troy, you know, she can't read, Law's emotions because she's not a biological entity, but you can see that Law is obviously scared, very much.
Well,
And the other,
Lal e-
go ahead.
well, Lal even verbalizes it by saying like, "This is
Oh,
what emotion is," and she hits herself in the
stomach.
stomach, like
Yeah,
when we
I can
feel
feel
that
it here.
pit in our stomach from anxiety or panic.
And the fact that she seems to have an innate, at the very end, that she has an innate understanding of love, which she expresses to her father.
So one of the things that happens in the episode is that um, Data takes Lal to Guinan and gets Lal a job at Guinan's bar in 10 forward with the idea that Lal will be able to observe humans socialize and Guinan will be able to be a good teacher in helping Lal develop these habits so she can coexist with the crew. One of the things that Lal observes early on is human affection, and she notices it in holding hands, but she also notices it in like people kissing and having relationships, and it leads to this funny scene with William Riker, where Riker, of course, being the horn dog he is, walks in and sees this pretty girl, Lal, behind the bar and hits on her, and Lal, thinking like, well, this is what men do, just plants him with this kiss, and then Data walks in and says, "What are your intentions? Ha ha ha."
Yeah,
Great scene. It's a really good scene, and
it
like
is.
I said, it's one of the few scenes that Riker's in.
Right, exactly.
Which, good on Jonathan Frakes for like taking the piss on himself.
Right.
Um, but one of the key moments is that Law kind of returns from her job and realizes, well, she goes to school and she realizes that like the kids were making fun of her, and Data has to explain to her like there's good humor and there's bad humor, and there's humor where people are laughing with you, and there's humor where people are laughing there's humor where people are laughing with you,
Right.
and humor where people are laughing at you.
Right.
And after they have that discussion, Law wants to show Data affection by holding his hand.
That's right. Yes.
And of course, at the very end, when Law unfortunately passes, spoiler, folks, but we'll get there, she of course tells Data she loves him. Um, Law has human emotions from the get go. I think the problem is, and it's something that we've always discussed in the show, you and I, Data has emotions too, and we see them multiple times through the show. Every time she learns and she succeeds at learning a new skill, there's a noticeable look of pride on Data's face. And part of it may be like pride in himself and being able to teach his daughter to do these things, but it's also like there's moments where he's surprised that she's able to pick up certain things. Um, Data shows regret and remorse and concern throughout this entire episode and takes like the the questioning of his fitness as a parent and also the custody of Law with a deadly sincerity which may not be overt and open, but there's a clear emotion behind all this. The idea that Data doesn't feel love in this episode, and even when he says he doesn't, is just not true. And even there's this scene where like Lal is having this kind of existential crisis with Data in their apartment where she's like, but I'll never know love. I'll never know how this feels. I'll never be able to experience this. And, that's where we get to the point where Data talks about the struggle of it. And, this is kind of worth it. Um, I think we
Is,
keep
is
saying these androids don't know how to love, but I think, and this gets to your question about can you have a child born of technology and it still be considered a child? I think when love's involved, a lot of these borders are shed. A lot of these confinements are broken, and a lot of these definitions and categories automatically disappear.
does does Data have the ability to understand emotions but not feel them? Where it seems that he's made
Ooh, good question.
he's made some advance with Lal, where she's able to, as she matures, she's beginning to understand um, the emotions, but she can feel them also. And
So,
that's important because it seems like the reason that she has this system cascade failure is that she has some abilities that her father, that Data does not have, and it's this confusion at the end
oh,
seems to go cause the failure.
I disagree. I absolutely disagree. I think he does have them, and the reason why she has this cascading failure is because he has them in the ability to, and he has had the ability to process them while she has not. Um, so we have to remember the design of Data. Dr. Sung designed Data with this heuristic function where he is able to learn and process new things and improve himself over time. Like, that's Data's main strength, and he keeps saying that's main strength. Like, I might not be human, but I can improve myself over time to the point where one day I might be human. So, remember Deja Q? What does Q reward Data with at the very end of the episode?
The experience of having genuine laughter.
Isn't laughter an emotion of joy?
Yes,
Doesn't Data feel an actual emotion in that moment and even say it was wonderful?
yes.
So Data has this heuristic function where he takes his experiences and processes them and learns and improves from them. So every time Data has experienced some form of emotion, and we've seen episodes where he's experienced some form of emotion, he is taking that and he is learning from it and he is processing it. Arguably, the question is, does he feel emotion? I maybe not, but does he understand and maybe even have emotions? I would have to say yes.
Well, when you bring up good points in that, you talk.
He at least has the data for them.
Data has the ability to go through heuristic processes.
Yes.
He is the best. He's really doing machine learning to the nth degree. And
Yes.
machine learning is a term that's just become into the lexicon in the last several years. I think in 1990 there were probably only some nerdy scientists at Bell Labs or MIT that even maybe have talked about machine learning at then.
Well, can I give a definition of what machine learning is?
Yes, and then I want to finish the point. Go ahead.
Of course. So, machine learning is the use and development of computer systems that are able to learn and adapt without following explicit instructions. These machines use algorithms and statistical models to analyze and draw inferences from patterns in data.
So,
But go on. That's
so,
essentially what machine learning is.
so when you mention that Data has the ability with time through the heuristic processes to improve himself, is the problem that Law has that she's actually being forced too fast, and
Yes.
that's what caused the cascade failure.
Yes. Data has Data has developed a heuristic function where he can meter how much emotion he feels and process them over time to where he understands them, where Lal is just being hit all the time with new things where her system just can't keep up. Data has been able to data system has evolved with him. Lal has to start off, and this is the problem, and I think this is where maybe the failure of Data's design is where Dr. Sung succeeded. Dr. Sung has something unique to Data and Lore's heuristic model where they are able to handle this large load. This large load of extrasensory and sensory perception that includes emotions in the psychological aspect of existence that Data was not able to give Lal.
So when Data created Lal, his offspring, in some ways were her positronic systems in advance over what Data has, but they had some flaws in them that Data didn't, he couldn't self-realize, as where Dr. Soon, when he created Data, could. And that was built in the, you know, the tragic flaw, the tragic error that caused the system cascade failure.
Can I actually suppose at what I think this is? Because I did some research with Memory Alpha, and
Go ahead.
they don't really talk about like the impetus behind the death of Lal. Um, I think obviously you have to get the android Lal off the show some way. She's not going to go to Galore 4 because that's not what anyone wants in the story. So that conceit's there. But and I can only speak to this as a parent, and I have to say, and I'm getting a little emotional about it right now. The end of the Offspring is very hard, and I always liked this episode because it always hit me at the end, but it didn't hit me until I actually had Ben, and have to deal with the idea that you could lose your child. And I think like what this story is just talking about like the real possibility of what the world has in store for everyone. You know, Admiral Haftel makes a really good point, which is always difficult when it comes to the question of Sung type androids. Data is one and unique. So him being on the Star Trek, being on the Starship Enterprise, he's earned his way there, and because of what happened in the Measure of a Man, he has the right to self-determine where he is. I think that Picard makes a really good point to Admiral Haftel that, Data's sentience determined his rights, and I should know I was there in determining them determining them for him. I don't think that there is any way that Picard would have failed to go to Starfleet Command and obtain Lal's rights.
No, that's a very good point that we haven't covered. That yeah, that's where there's sort of a redundancy, but a positive redundancy from Measure of a Man, where Picard really, stands up for Lal's rights, just as he did previously for Data's rights.
But yes, but I think what this story also for me talks about is you have to be ready for the possibility that the world is not going to be any kinder to us. I mean, kinder to our children than it was to us. And we live in a world of chaos and death and destruction and misery. And, despite all those things, I'm still a big believer now in Camus. You have to find some sort of value, or else you end up a nihilist. But, you know, despite all that, finding value in not being a nihilist, you still have to deal with the fact that there's threats to your children every day.
Yes.
And I think Data just went through something that thankfully he doesn't have the emotions of grief and sorrow to have to process immediately. because the rest of us would be left as I was left, just sobbing and in tears because we can lose our children at any moment. But I can lose you or mom. I can lose my parents at any moment. I think the brilliance and the sad part about this story is that it's so real what happens to Lal. We can lose our children
Well,
for any reason at any moment. And it's even mirrored, I think, at the very last, when the cascade starts to happen, all the debate between Haftel and Picard about Lal's rights, and the debate whether or not Data is going to keep Lal or have to go with Haftel disappears. And even Haftel realizes that Data has a sense of parent has a sense of parenthood when it comes to Lal, and that this really is his child. And it almost becomes like two doctors having to save a child in surgery and everyone waiting outside.
two comments. One, a couple of
Yeah,
minutes ago,
sorry.
you made a comment that the death of Lal, and that's truly
Yeah.
what happened. That she died.
Yes.
She wasn't turned off. She died. And
Well, I can I quote her as she goes, because
yeah,
for me it's one of the most important. Well, I'm going to try not to cry, folks. So sorry. Um, I feel. What do you feel, Law? Data asks. I love you, Father. I wish I could feel it with you. I will feel it for both of us, Law said. Thank you for my life. Sorry, one sec. And as Law goes, she says in her final words, flirting, laughter, painting, family, female, human. Um, uh, those are she has a flash of her life right at the last moment, and she sees everything like I think we would in that final time. And it really does become, like you say, the death of Lal, and even Admiral Haftel when he comes out, like I was alluding to earlier, it's very much like two surgeons who failed to save a child on the operating table. And he's almost in tears by saying, I watched this father try to save his child and he just couldn't do it. And it just really hits home, the severity of the existence we have.
I was going to say that regarding Admiral Halftel is that he the actor that plays that role does it well because
Yes.
he's kind of a hard ass. He like when he walks into 10 forward to see Lau acting as a cocktail waitress, as he says it, he has that
Yeah.
he has that admiral swagger to him. Like I'm
If
you know,
if I may mention real quick,
yeah,
Admiral Haftel was played by Nicholas Coaster.
okay.
But
And
sorry, go on.
and he's kind of a hard ass, when he's talking to Data and he's talking to Picard and Lal because he's doing his job. And he makes the point that, look, Data, there's been one android, and now you've created
Yes.
another one. And, you're on a starship. The Romulans could come and destroy you, and we don't want to lose you both. So we don't want to lose this
Yes.
technology, the benefits. So he's being a hard ass, but he makes a good point. However, once he understands that Lal is in trouble, since he acknowledges that he
Is
is
a
a parent,
parent.
he immediately, his whole demeanor shifts and he says to Data, "What can I do to help?"
It's it's actually very brilliant this episode in terms of the framing of Hostel, because like you said, he does walk on with this authoritarian general swagger. But everyone that expects a villain by the time the episode ends, you see someone who's not a villain at all. And it actually gets into so touching from the emotion of Law's death. One thing that I really wanted to touch on here is I think a pivotal scene for Captain Jean-Luc Picard, and this is, I mentioned how important I think this episode is. This episode is also important to me because Dad, we talk about Captain Jean-Luc Picard a lot on this show and how important he is as a example for young men, but also for people in general. Um, I want to quote exactly um, his his quotes when Admiral Haftel orders Data to turn over Law. He basically says Data belay that order, and um, Haftel basically threatens his career, and Picard responds with, "There are times, sir, when men of good conscience cannot blindly follow orders. You acknowledge their sentience, but ignore their personal liberties and freedoms. Order a man to turn his child over to the state, not while I'm his captain. First of all, the
Yes,
most heroic shit in the world. Like
it is. Yeah.
that's real heroism, willing to give up, you know, he's willing to lose his command for his friend, but also because of an innate principle that
Yes. Right.
humanity matters
Right.
on a deep, deep level
Hmm.
that's worth fighting for. Um, what do you think about this question when it comes to how much does personal freedom and liberty matter when it comes to the well-being of a child, and how much do you think the state should have a part in that,
Mm.
in deciding that, versus the parents? um, I think we all agree with Jean-Luc Picard that Lal is a sentient being guaranteed her own rights and should not be turned over to the state. But in a real world scenario, um, what do you think of this argument? Because I think it's an argument of like how much the state reaches into our lives and how much control it has over us. I think that's something in 2021 and just in the 21st century in general we're going to be dealing with a lot. So,
I,
any reflections you have?
it's a very poignant question to where we are in November of 2021, and particularly in relationship to two things. One, the pandemic, with the controversy as to whether, you know, mask wearing should be required in public places,
Yes.
especially in schools, as a mechanism for public health, whether there should be vaccine mandates for citizens, again, to protect the public
Mm-hmm.
health. And, some of this is now that their vaccines,
Oh, vaccines for children.
the vaccines are approved for children down to age 5, I think, that,
Mm-hmm.
they're not mandated. And there's the argument that, look, everyone really should get vaccinated because that's the best protection against this virus, even though there is a slight chance of serious adverse reactions. And the
Mm-hmm.
other issue that has come up in a number of school systems around the United States. Particularly, it was a key issue in the recent Virginia gubernatorial race. Is what um, what does the local government, the local school board, what responsibility does the local school board have in determining what students are taught versus what the parents think should be taught?
Absolutely, and that has been a age-old feud that has been going on since. Well, I might get the case wrong, but do you remember the case where it's not Brown versus Board of Education? That was
Yeah,
integration.
that was integration.
Um, I'm thinking about the one about evolution.
Oh, like this, going back to the Scopes trial in 1925.
Scopes trial. Thank you.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, folks. It's
yeah.
10:30 at night. The
Clarence
Scopes
Darrow.
trial.
Yeah,
Well, there's always been a question about what we teach our children and how we teach them to perceive the world.
right.
Um,
And
I think
that's the perfect expression. That's what this whole it all relates to. How do you teach the concept of critical race theory? Um,
yeah.
which is the example is what? How do you teach
Well, I
children?
think how do you teach any children any? How do you teach children to view the world in any way, shape, or form? And what sort of responsibilities do you have in terms of their decision making in that? Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, yeah,
Like that is really when it comes to education, the the center of the philosophical debate. Like, how are we making the best citizens we can to go forward, not only as in a community, but also as like free thinking and hopefully quality individuals. I think the hard I, I think the hard thing about all this is like, on one hand, the state should have responsibility for children when it's been proven that like parents are inept or incompetent at doing it. Like, we can't leave small children to be victimized by the irresponsibilities or the malice of their parents.
Well, and that's where there is some benefit to standardized testing. But that subject is controversial also.
Well, it's hard to. So, the way I see a lot of the controversies that we're having now when it comes to child rearing, especially when it comes to like you brought up critical race theory, which for those listening at home, is a legal framing in terms of how we can look at and interpret laws that affect communities of color and marginalized communities in terms of how the law just deals with them. It is taught in schools. It is taught in ways that are controversial. I am not fully read. I am read up on the subject, but I'm not fully read up on the subject, and it's not something we're going to get into tonight. Um, I actually think there will be an episode down the line where we can talk about this. But I think when it comes to children's education, it's so hard to set a standard for what is quality and what is quantitative, and then at the same time determine on kind of a batch level how these kids are supposed to be valued. And in some ways, like, we're asking an impossible task of like requiring schools to teach children how to value themselves, but at the same time asking schools to give these children value. Where at home, this is something that the family really needs to be doing.
Well, here's the other aspect to it in terms of
And in this, and but in the, I should make it a point. Like, even in Star Trek, I think they would make the argument that I just made that the family should be doing it because Picard is making the argument that like, look, you can't take a child from their parent without the parents express intent, especially if the parent has rights that we've determined for them.
well, there's another aspect just to, we don't need to get into it in depth in terms of, the state responsibility for rearing of the child is
Right.
the, you mentioned that, if parents do not or cannot provide enough educational support to a child, and you have a program like Head Start, where you want to
Yes.
make sure that young children have access to pre-kindergarten education, socialization skills. I mean, that's shown to be very valuable,
Mm-hmm.
particularly for families who are on the lower end of the economic scale. And the other issue that kind of, is being discussed right now is, how much money should be put into the social safety net, if that's the appropriate term to use, in terms of providing subsidies for childcare so that mothers can work, since it's very necessary now with their economic condition in most cases
So,
for both parents to work.
so I think that we've discussed the episode very well, but can I get on my soapbox and end the episode
Yeah.
a little bit on this subject? I'm not actually going to get up on my soapbox, but I'm very much well read in economics, and I've helped people write and edit economics before, so I actually have some insight into
Go ahead.
this,
Go ahead.
and some actual policy insight, if people would allow me for the moment. One of the things that the Biden administration failed to do this year in 2021, in part of the Senate reconciliation bill that was later which is still kind of floating out there, but as far as I'm concerned, it's dead because they got what they really wanted, which was the infrastructure package. But part of that was going to be paid family leave. Now, paid family leave was going to have multiple benefits. The number one that I saw was ending the wage gap between men and women. Because the wage disparity is not actually one that we pay women less. Women actually just earn less because women are forced to make biological decisions that men are not foisted with. So, a woman without paid child leave goes not, potentially 4 to 5 months, depending on her medical status, without getting paid because if she can't work. Um, Unfortunately, a lot of jobs don't offer paid family leave during their hospital stay or their immediate recovery. Uh, Ben, if you're listening to this, your mother and I were very lucky that when we were in New York that she was able to get FMLA, but also some family leave that allowed her to stay home for the first 4 months of your life. And those first 4 months were so important in terms of developing proper social and maternal bonds between mother and child, but also like it also gave me a chance to develop bonds paternally with Ben or with you, Ben, that, I think really do add to the quality of a child's overall life in the long term. Now, we're recording this in 2021, Ben, and you're not even two, so you could be listening to this and be like, my life sucks, Dad, thanks. So, but, we tried our best. Anyway, um, I think that the moment you give people paid child leave, men and women, not only does it close the wage gap between um, men and women, but it also gives families the economic ability to make decisions for children on a real qualitative basis in terms of uh, food, clothing. We look at things like food and clothing and we think that they're small things when it comes to a child's upbringing, but your ability to clothe your child appropriately based on your situation is dramatically important. Your ability to feed your child a nourishing diet, more than just formula or your own breast milk, but progress beyond that and give them like a wide range of options. I understand why impoverished families are really worried about their children growing up with a big obesity because all they got to eat was McDonald's. The only reason a lot of them only got to eat McDonald's is because McDonald's is so cheap versus like organic food you can buy in the grocery store, even with food stamps or EBT. You know, Having the ability to actually leave to take care of your family and still earn some sort of living wage allows people an economic freedom and ability to grow their household not only on a social and individual level, but on an economic level that not only benefits them as a household, but also their community at large and society on a larger scale because this money not only stays within a household, but it also keeps working out of the household in back in, and it just keeps the markets liquid. If
Yeah,
you give people money and you give them the ability to spend even when they're not working, it's
right,
actually a boost to the economy.
right.
Paid family leave should not be seen as something that will take away, but it'll be something that like helps us, especially in the post-COVID era,
Uh,
keep things going because like
yeah,
this system only works on market liquidity. It only works when money's moving. And for money to be moving, people have to have jobs, unfortunately. Like and Dad, and I'm sorry if I'm on my soapbox, one of the reasons why Democrats might get fucking stomped in 2022 and 2024 is because they're not focusing on economics, stupid. They're not focusing on like bills and college debt, and they're not focusing on credit cards, and they're not focusing on banks, and they're not focusing on like the meat and potatoes thing that everyone, no matter what community you're in, has to deal with. We all have to work to live, unfortunately, in this system to some extent. And we're currently in a system where like working to live is so much harder than what we're getting back from it. Or at least that's what society feels at the moment, if I'm correct. Um, the thing that like needs to be done is that you need to give money, and Andrew Yang, whether you love him or hate him, I'm slowly warming to him again, but he had this idea of a universal basic income where everyone would get $1,000 a month. That's completely possible, and not only that, like it turns out when people were given $1,000 a month during pilot studies, they put it into childcare, they put it into medical care, they put it into schooling or housing. These people are actually using it to live and augment their lives for the better. So, something like paid family leave would, I know it seems like focusing on this one thing and acting like it's such a panacea for so many issues may seem inappropriate, but it's really not. The ability for people to still make financial decisions and have some sort of security while they have to have a medical event or take care of themselves in a way that forgoes them working for a bit should not only be a goal of any functioning society, but you know it should be almost a requirement because it just keeps things going, and we have to keep things going. My biggest concern and my biggest criticisms of my Republican and conservative components is like, fine, you talk about a free market, you talk about basic rights and liberties, and you talk about like the little person having the ability to go out there and make their dreams come true. Well, the only way you do that is by keeping the fucking marketplace going, you fucking numbnut assholes. Like, if you really want people to like take part in the free market, you have to give them the tools and the resources to take part in the first place. And that means also giving them the social safety net so when they have to leave the free market for a bit, they can come back to it without, having suffered
Well,
catastrophic damage beforehand.
well, listen, let's I have one more thing to say about the episode, but if you know there's an opportunity you have now that you've stated a very well put policy that I totally agree with. There's an office down on 181st
Ah,
where you
ah,
live, and that's a congressman's office. And you know,
I know
you,
that guy.
you know that guy.
Great.
Well, your name could be up there. You could take over that congressman's office someday. So
Ah, don't
you
wish
put
that on
you,
me.
you,
Anyway,
you put yourself there. Don't
yeah.
don't put that on me, Ricky Bobby. Right?
Don't you put that evil on me.
Yeah.
So
The
what
last
do you
thing
want to say about the episode, and we'll
I
go.
just just in terms of your you know emotional feelings about the death of Law, there is a little bit of positive ending where the
Yes.
when Data goes back onto the bridge and everyone expresses condolences and for his loss. He typical Data with his understanding, his non-emotional understanding of emotions or expressions of emotion. He says, but La's not gone because I've incorporated her memories into mine. So
Yeah.
it's a unique ability he has that her the essence of her positronic brain is within him still.
Well, it on one hand, it's a beautiful thing because he doesn't have to deal with the immediate grief of losing his child. Because we the last episode, I think we had that discussion of like our body about the Bhagavad Gita and how our bodies are like changing of clothes.
Right.
Maybe Data sees like the death of Law's physical body is just a change in the clothes, and she's been reincorporated into him.
Yeah.
Like there is a little bit of a spiritual aspect to
Yeah,
that.
there is. Absolutely.
Well, Dad, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Good.
I think that this was a
Very
great
good.
episode.
Yes.
Yeah. We will be back next time for Star Trek's season 3, episode 17, Sins of the Father, which is a big clean on episode. So we'll see you all again soon.
Okay. Good night, Jay.
Night.